Welcome back, everyone. We will now begin consideration of Bill number 103, the Accessible Saskatchewan Act, Clause 1-1, short title. Minister Makowski is here with his officials. I would ask that officials please state their names before speaking into the microphone the first time. Minister, please introduce your officials and make any opening remarks that you have.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair and committee members. As you mentioned, I'm here to present Bill 103, the Accessible Saskatchewan Act. With me are Kimberly Krasik, Deputy Minister, Assistant Deputy Ministers Louise Michaud and Joel Kilbride, Executive Directors Daryl Stubel, Stephanie Willidall, and Sterling Snyder are here to answer questions. So just a few brief opening remarks, if I could. Persons with disabilities represent nearly a quarter of our province's population. This figure is expected to grow as our population ages. In the 2019 throne speech, we made a commitment to engage with Saskatchewan residents to develop accessibility legislation. To ensure persons with disabilities can participate and contribute to our communities, we know it's important to develop legislation that makes Saskatchewan a more accessible and inclusive province. Following public engagement, we took an important step forward in working toward a more inclusive and accessible province by introducing the Accessible Saskatchewan Act. The purpose of this legislation is to aid in the identification, prevention, and removal of accessibility barriers for persons with disabilities. The disability community is diverse, and we recognize that people experience barriers differently. We've included a broad definition of disability in the Act to acknowledge its diversity and to promote the inclusion of all persons with disability. In developing this legislation, we've considered the different types of barriers experienced by persons with disabilities, such as physical barriers, communication barriers, attitudinal barriers, just to name a few. To address these barriers, this legislation allows government to develop standards in the areas of the built environment, information and communications, employment, transportation, service animals, procurement, service delivery, and any future areas that are needed. The Act also establishes the Accessibility Advisory Committee, which will provide advice to the development of standards in each of these areas. It's important that people with lived experience are involved in the development of accessibility standards. That's why at least half of this committee will be persons with disabilities or from organizations representing persons with disabilities. We will develop an application process to ensure the committee is representative of the population of Saskatchewan and reflects its diversity. Under this legislation, the government and designated public sector bodies will be required to develop accessibility plans within 1 and 2 years, respectively, of the Act coming into force. These plans will identify the actions that will be taken to remove and prevent barriers that individuals who are in or interact with these organizations face. Continuing with the spirit of nothing about us without us, the Government of Saskatchewan is committed to our ongoing engagement with persons with disabilities when developing accessibility standards and plans. Proposed standards will be made publicly available for at least 60 days, ensuring everyone has the opportunity to comment and provide feedback. As the minister and ministers in the future, it will be their responsibility to raise awareness of how barriers impact the ability of persons with disabilities to fully participate in their communities. To support this work, the Saskatchewan Accessibility Office will be established. The office will be responsible for leading regulation development, increasing public awareness about accessibility, and providing education and support to organizations to help them comply with the Act. An annual report will be released each year, which will outline progress made in implementing the legislation. The report will be publicly available to promote accountability and transparency in this important work. The needs of individuals and society evolve and change over time. To respond to these changing needs, the Act will be reviewed 7 years after coming into force and every 10 years thereafter. This timeline ensures there's adequate time between reviews to implement recommendations and assess their impacts. I'd like to highlight one part of the Act that has already been well received. Through the Act, we recognize sign languages as the primary languages of communication for persons who are deaf in Saskatchewan. Members of the deaf community told us the inclusion of this clause is significant for them, and I look forward to seeing many more positive impacts the implementation of this Act has for residents across the province. So that concludes my remarks, Mr. Chair. We'd be happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Minister. At this time, I will open the floor to questions, and I recognize Ms. Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Minister for his opening remarks. And then I think I'm just going to dive right into it, Minister. My first question is I heard positive feedback about the definition of disability within the Act, and I know that was one of the concerns raised by folks involved in consultations leading up to this Act. What percentage of people in Saskatchewan, when you develop this bill, how many people are you kind of operating on the assumption live with the kind of disability that would be covered under this Act in Saskatchewan today?
So as I said in my opening comments, roughly 25% of the population would fall under the definition. My understanding that definition comes from Stats Canada.
Sorry, Minister, I missed that in your opening comments. Thank you for that clarification. Can you talk about the application of the bill? I think one of the concerns that I've heard from folks is that the bill seems to mainly apply to public bodies rather than private bodies. Can you speak to that under the Act?
Thank you. Louise Michaud. So the application of the bill, so one of the things that we did here during consultation was that people asked that government be leaders in implementing this bill. So the way that it is laid out in the after the first year, government will be required to have its accessibility plan ready and available. And then 2 years after that, or 2 years after the bill comes into force, then it would be public bodies. Now, when you talk about application of the bill, as standards are developed, there will be sort of decisions made to whom they apply at that time. Certain standards would apply just by their very nature to different people, different classes of people, as they say. So, for example, you might have any access standards that relate to service animals. Those would apply universally, but then you might have, depending on the standard being developed, it may be that government would apply it to itself first to sort of show leadership and to develop, and then, so those decisions would be made during regulation development.
Thank you, Ms. Michaud. Just in terms of, for example, the accessibility plans, like I'm looking at the Act here, and it contemplates the government of Saskatchewan yet to be named public sector bodies, and then any other prescribed person. I understand and wholly support this idea of government being leaders, but I don't see anything under the Act that contemplates the application to the private sector going forward. Can you point me to anything within the Act that points to that being part of this accessibility plan contemplated under the Act?
Yeah, so as you noted, it says any other prescribed person, and that's where, as going forward, decisions may be made to have, the plans, the requirement for plans could be made to apply to, different classes within the private sector. So that's something that would be made going forward.
So that's something that would appear in, for example, regulation?
Yes.
Okay, are there currently plans in the works to go there is there a timeline or plans to go there in the next, 5 to 10 years?
Thank you. No decisions have been made at this point. What we will be doing, we'll be focusing on taking the steps needed to implement the legislation. And so our first sort of areas of focus will be on developing the general regulations, the prescribing of public bodies, et cetera, and taking the steps to establish the Public Advisory Committee. And then sort of as we work on regulations with with the advisory committee, then we'd be making those decisions going forward.
Thank you. Of course, there was quite a bit of delay in and sort of expectation, I think, around this bill. And when we're contemplating the full participation of folks with disability in their communities, it has to involve the private sector. People's experiences don't just involve the government or public bodies. And I would note that the most effective way to do that and ensure compliance is through legislation. And there have been some really imaginative things done in other jurisdictions, kind of economic incentives to the private sector. Because, of course, what I heard in my consultations is the private sector actually has a lot to gain by being much more accessible in terms of, the economic benefits that they would enjoy as a result of opening up their places of business or whatever it is, their organizations to, as you noted, potentially 25% of the population. So as disability critic, I was disappointed to see that this hasn't yet been contemplated, and it was a major source of feedback to me in preparing for committee folks, hoping to kind of bring that message that is very much something I think people would like to see. And there's all kinds of really promising ways to do that wouldn't just overburden the private sector if that's the concern. So, wanting to just kind of put that on the record here tonight, that I'm really hoping that that's something that, that becomes a priority going forward. But in terms of the act as it exists, Ms. Michaud made reference to certain standards that are applied universally. Could you just maybe explain to me what you mean by that? You referenced the service dog example. Like, are you saying that some of those standards, that the private or all sectors will be subject to some of those universal standards? I just didn't quite understand, Ms. Michaud, what you meant by that.
My example was, my service animal example was really related to, for example, where if you're talking about access rights, then that would just by its very nature apply to the private sector. So, the thing that I think you referenced, accessibility plans, and that is the sort of first year, second year with the publics, with government and then public sector bodies. But it's just depending on the standards that are being developed and by their nature, then decisions will be made on to whom they apply. And that's so just to explain a little bit, you would have, if you have sort of access and training standards for service animals, then those would just by their very nature need to apply to the private sector to ensure that people who use service animals would have access rights.
So does something like that exist currently? Like, is there anything under this act that you speak about these access rights, if there was, say, a private sector entity that wasn't honoring that standard, is there anything that could sort of address that under the act as it exists today?
Okay, thank you. So the way that the Act is designed, so what it is, it's mainly enabling for us to, for government to make regulations. So there are some key areas, service animals, the built environment, information communications, transportation, pardon me, and I have to, and the reason the way that the Act is organized right now is that it enables making those standards, and then once the decisions are made and the standards are in regulations, then the Act would apply. The other important thing to note about this Act is that it is intended to work in tandem with existing regulation, with existing legislation. So it's not intended to duplicate legislation such as the Human Rights Code. Potentially, you could be looking at employment standards, legislation, etc. So it may be the standards would be, clarifying or filling in gaps from those pieces of legislation to ensure that barriers are removed, but it wouldn't be sort of creating a new, a duplicating standard. So for example, for service animals, there are already access rights, and then standards might be developed to sort of clarify and make some definitions there. The things that the Act requires right away without regulations are the making of the accessibility plans.
Thank you, Ms. Michaud. So I guess, is it fair to say that the immediate focus is for government to develop these accessibility plans? I think the government of Saskatchewan has a year, subsequent public bodies have 3 years, and then the regulation will kind of flesh out the standards for kind of the rest of folks in due time. Is that kind of the idea?
So, thank you. So, yes, you're correct. Government will have 1 year subsequent to coming into force to develop its accessibility plan. For public sector bodies, it will be 2 years. And then regulations will be made, in consultation with the community, so with the advisory committee, and hearing from the disability community to, and regulations there will be made, and requirements sort of in a number of areas.
The Accessibility Advisory Committee, it would be really interesting to hear that the advisory committees, one of their main purposes is to develop the actual regulations. Is that the plan? Like, I note here that that committee will be formed according to the regulations. So to me, when I read the Act, I thought the regulations would kind of already be in place. I love this idea that the advisory committee will be actively involved in creating those regulations around accessibility standards. Is that what's being contemplated, Minister?
Yeah, so there are a number of steps that we that are planned around developing the policies and processes for establishing the advisory committee, receiving applications, etc. And then they will be involved in, in the regulation making process by providing, they'll be involved in the design and then providing recommendations to government for the regulations.
Thank you. You mentioned the Human Rights Code, and I guess, again, one of the consistent areas of feedback I got around the Act was, in a perfect world, in the current world, public bodies should be providing barrier-free services, particularly government, and that the Human Rights Code and the Charter already requires that of government and of public bodies. So the concern is, what work is the Accessibility Act doing? How would you respond to that, Minister?
Hi, Stephanie Willittle. Thanks for the question. Yes, so the Human Rights Code contains prohibitions based on discrimination. Of course, disability is one of them. And so what our legislation is going to do is have specific requirements in each of those 7 key areas. So if it's the accessible employment standards, we'll have specific accessibility requirements throughout the hiring cycle.
A little more meat on the bone.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's really good to hear. I think that is, some of the disappointment around the sector is just, arguably public sector bodies should be doing that work. Although the Charter and the Human Rights Code doesn't provide that sort of detailed breakdown of how, government as an employer, for example, needs to create that workplace. These are arguably things that should be happening or should have been happening. I guess one of the questions I had is, to what extent did a dialogue with the Human Rights Commission inform at all the Act? I know, I don't know specifically. I know that a number of the complaints they get are around, barriers in workplaces and other places. Did you have any kind of dialogue with the Human Rights Commission around the kinds of complaints they were seeing, the number of complaints they were seeing, and is anything in this Act or the contemplated regulations kind of directly responsive to some of the issues that maybe we're seeing come up again and again?
Thanks for the question. Yes, so we did meet with the Human Rights Commission prior to our public engagement just to make sure we're on the right track. And then they did participate in a number of our engagement opportunities, the virtual discussion forums and submitting survey responses. And they gave us information about what the common complaints they receive regarding disability are, and that helped us inform the 7 key areas that we're going to develop those specific requirements in.
Thank you for that. Can you speak a bit more about those areas that they were kind of specifically seeing concerns around?
Thank you. Yes, so when we met with them, we certainly considered all the complaint information that they shared with us, which was really great. And we looked across to the other provinces too that have accessibility legislation to see what are those barriers that persons with disabilities are currently experiencing. And so that really informed those 7 key areas, and those were also based on the public engagement feedback as well.
Minister, is it possible at all to provide a little more detail about the nature of the complaints we were hearing about, without obviously, saying anything that would tend to reveal the identity of anyone? Obviously, that would be private, but surely there were some themes and some categories. Can you speak to that?
Okay, so thank you. So basically, as mentioned, the themes of the complaints that we've been receiving did have a great deal to do with informing the 7 key areas that we've identified for regulation and standard development. So, for example, when the built environment, we would be looking at potentially where people might not be able to access a physical space, even if a building meets building codes requirements, but there might be, very simple things like parking spaces, accessible parking spaces that are either not properly designed or don't exist, or outside walkways that are not covered under existing building codes, but still caused people to have barriers accessing a physical space. So that's one of the areas that the Human Rights Commission did identify. Information and communications, again, that has been things like the ability to acquire information either from a public body or a business in a manner that people can access. So that might be things like either a plain language or, the ability to have interpretation in a manner that, like access to sign language interpreters. So those are some of the areas. Of course, access to employment, and so that would be potentially ensuring that people have equal access to an accessible interview guide, or that interviews are done in a manner that people can fully participate. Certainly, transportation. This may be, for example, where there's been situations where either ride share or cab companies would not have wheelchair accessible transportation available, or might refuse to take a service animal. Service animals themselves, certainly, access to public spaces, being denied access. And then finally, we're looking at opportunities for, people wanting opportunities to participate in sort of public life. So that's why we've included procurement as something that has to consider accessibility standards, in its design.
Thank you, and I'm glad to hear the focus will not just be on citizens who use government services, but folks who work within these public bodies. I did hear a fair amount of concern around, accessible workplaces and opportunities. I guess I want to, just before I move off the topic of the sort of limited application, if I can call it that, I think some of the nature of the feedback I got was that there's a concern that there are portions that the Act has some good definitions, as I said, has some aspirational elements, but there's a lot of language around encouraging compliance. How do I put this? A lot of language around monitoring, reviewing, encouraging compliance with accessibility standards. Not a lot of language around enforcement, requirements. So I think there's a concern or a fair amount of anxiety on the part of folks that were looking to this legislation that it lacks teeth, I guess, is where I'm going with that. And I'll just give you an example. If I look at subsection 2, subsection 2-2, 6 and 7. So for example, this is under accessibility plans. These are these accessibility plans we were discussing. And just for all the folks tuning in at home, the legislation kind of contemplates two separate things. The requirement of accessibility plans for government, for yet to be prescribed public sector bodies, and for yet to be prescribed persons on the one hand, and then it also contemplates the application of accessibility standards. Now, under the accessibility plan portion of the Act, subsection 6, the government, and this is top of page 5, the government of Saskatchewan and any public sector body must establish processes for reviewing comments from the public with respect to their accessibility plan. So there we see an example of that really strong word, the word must. And then in the next provision, we see if the director becomes aware of a deficiency with respect to an accessibility plan of a public sector body to which this section applies, the director may, A, provide that public sector body with notice of the deficiency, and B, in the notice mentioned, direct that the deficiency be remedied within a specified period. And there's a few examples like that throughout the Act, which were a significant red flag for me and for many of the other folks I consulted with, where people expected to see really like a signal that these standards will be taken really seriously, that there's going to be implementation, that there's going to be consequences if they're not implemented, because we know, this is this is really the best way to make change, is to require these things, not to give people the option, not to give the minister discretion, but to require these things. And if people don't comply, to have a consequence. And I see that throughout the Act. And so I understand where that anxiety on the part of folks are coming from. You know, the Act as it exists, it contemplates these application plans and accessibility standards, but and there's a lot of encouragement language. But again, the focus is on encouraging folks to come up with a plan, not necessarily defining the application of the plan, and certainly not implementing the plan at risk of consequences. So, Minister, could you speak to those concerns? Because I understand why people have them, and I have them myself just reviewing the Act in terms of a lot of the language that was chosen. That language has a lot of power when we look at legislation, the difference between may and must. So can you speak to that?
Thank you. Yeah, so the way that the bill is designed and the sort of the intent behind it is first to work with, obligated individuals and persons to make sure that we help them to identify barriers to accessibility and educate on how to remove them. And then in the example you cited where the director sort of may make an order to correct a deficiency in a plan. And the reason that that was done was because, where rather than have the director respond to all, obligate the director to respond to all plan deficiencies with a formal order, this gives the flexibility for the director to be able to provide a response. So often it may be just sort of informing that there's a deficiency, and a formal order may not be necessary. Now, there are built into the legislation where sort of compliance continues to not happen. There will be opportunities for administrative penalties to be applied, and there's also the ability to have a fine of up to $250,000. So, the idea is that the bill has sort of starts with trying to educate people, to have them learn sort of what the barriers that are in place are. Here's how to remove them. If there are deficiencies, how to correct them. But the bill does have the opportunity for sort of non-compliance to be enforced.
The accessibility plans, there are no requirements for self-reporting with respect to the progress of the plan. I noted that every 3 years they're supposed to be reviewed, but I was concerned to see that there's no requirement of self-reporting throughout the process. And I guess together with the lack of sort of concrete guidance for these plans, which is in contrast to the delineation of some of the barriers in subsection 5.1. That concerned me. Can you speak to that minister. I also don't note a link in the legislation between these accessibility plans and accessibility standards. And under the accessibility standards section, it applies to prescribed persons only, not government or public sector bodies. Can you speak to that aspect of the Act as well?
Thank you. Yes, so for the accessibility plans, that requirement, any obligated organization that's required to do a plan, they have to consult with persons with disabilities to understand what the current barriers are in interacting with that organization, because that's a really important information. So what are those barriers? And then based on that information, the organization will identify the actions they're going to take to address those. And so the other thing is that they'll be considering certain principles of inclusion, adaptability, diversity, collaboration, self-determination, and universal design. And another thing about the plans is that, so for the government and public sector bodies, they must establish a process for for receiving comments from the public with respect to their plans. So that's another requirement related to that.
So, Minister, my question was around the lack of requirements for self-reporting for the accessibility plans and the lack of link between the accessibility standards and the accessibility plans. I'm sure the hope in developing these accessibility standards is that they'll have broad application to many different contexts. So why not specifically provide for that link in the legislation? Can you speak to that?
Thank you. So for reporting, one of the ways that government would be reporting, for example, on its accessibility plan would be through the annual report that it's required to table and report progress on implementing the legislation. As far as the link between the plans themselves and the standards. So the reason that that's not sort of specifically identified is that any organization may be developing or removing barriers where either only one standard applies or maybe multiple standards apply, but it's unlikely that any one plan would be touching on all of the standards. One of the other things to note is that, you know, the needs of persons with disabilities, the nature of barriers, et cetera, will change. And that's why we linked it to the principles, the overall principles. And then the standards themselves, you know, once they apply, they don't need, like that goes without saying. It's like any other piece of legislation that the plans that are developed would have to be consistent with the requirements of those standards.
So all the bodies and the government of Saskatchewan will, and any future prescribed persons will have to do, once they're kind of tagged to do an accessibility plan, they'll have to submit an annual report? Sorry, I missed that.
No, it's government has to submit an annual report, but no, there's not a specific, you know, annual report for reporting plans. One of the things is that as plans are reviewed, that would have to be done. You know, there has to be a mechanism for receiving comments from the community, and then people would then be sort of, you know, aware of and providing information on progress to the plan.
Okay, another concern I had was, and question I had was around so that accessibility plan, section 2.2, the government of Saskatchewan, public sector bodies, any other prescribed persons are the three entities contemplated under that section. But then subsection 7 only contemplates public sector bodies. It says, if the director becomes aware of a deficiency with respect to an accessibility plan of a public sector body to which this section applies, the director may, and we've gone over that provision. Why not prescribed persons and government of Saskatchewan, why are they left out of that? It seems like a bit of a gaping hole.
Thank you. So the Act does require that, does apply that the director may make, may make orders for corrected deficiencies in a public sector plan. So it does apply to public sector bodies. The other bodies as prescribed, that's not contemplated currently, but it's a decision that could be made later. And then the other piece, the reason you asked about government's plan is that the way that government's plan is anticipated to be made is will be, made in collaboration across ministries, and that will already include, the director as a direct educator and contributor to the making of that plan.
Does that mean that the threat of an administrative penalty, though, doesn't apply to the other entities contemplated under this section? That's my concern, is the lack of teeth, that it only applies to public sector bodies, not the government of Saskatchewan and not any future prescribed persons.
Thank you. So the administrative penalties do not, they're not limited to the plan. Each set of standards, regulations will identify to whom they apply and what the requirements are, and, you know, sort of what the potential administrative penalties would be there.
You're talking, Ms. Michaud, about Part 7? Like, Part 7 of the Act, like the offenses, administrative penalties, and appeals under Part 7?
Sorry, just one moment.
Just, we want to clarify what, you asked if it was referring to Part 7 in reference to Ms. Michaud's answer?
So it seems that there's, like, in terms of compliance, there's Part 7, offenses, administrative penalties, and appeals, which appear to apply to persons. So Section 7(1) there, it says, "No person shall," and it goes through a list, including contravene any provision of this act. And that's where the potential to fine an entity $250,000 is, up to, which Ms. Michaud had referenced earlier. I guess I'm a little unclear about how that Part 7, or the offenses and administrative penalty portion of the act, relate to this deficiency this administrative penalty mentioned under the accessibility plans and sign language portion of the act, so that's Part 2. I'm having trouble squaring those, because subsection 2-2, sorry, Section 2-2, subsection 7 and 8 contemplate if a public sector body fails to remedy a deficiency, the director may impose an administrative penalty pursuant to Section 7(3). I see. Sorry, I think I'm maybe working it out in my own mind. Can you give me one moment just to read this? Yeah, thanks. -3. It appears that subsection Part 7, it's contemplated that that will be the enforcement, like the administrative penalty enforcement system for future prescribed persons. So this subsection, 2-2 subsection 7 and 8 clarifies that that administrative penalty regime also applies to public sector bodies. Am I summarizing that correctly? Sorry, it's hard to do this also just verbally without pointing to the act, but maybe if I could also clarify my question. So a breach of the act or regulation can result in an inspection/order and administrative penalty contemplated under Part 6, in particular 6-9 and, 6-9. And then there's this separate regime for failing to address a deficiency under 2-2 subsection 8 and 7-3, but no power to require compliance with respect to any deficiency, as far as I can tell. I'm just, can you speak to those two compliance pieces and administrative penalty pieces? I'm just a little, maybe I'm just confused and I need to be straightened out.
Thank you. Yes, I'll try to provide a bit of clarity if I can. So maybe I'll just go to high level. The purpose of those plans is for the organization to identify those barriers that persons experience when they interact with that organization. So 227 is, so those public sector bodies and government have to publicly post their plan. And so if the director's made aware of a deficiency in the plan, that's really a poor plan, a plan that you can tell didn't put a lot of work into, not a lot of reflection on what are those existing barriers and what actions are they going to take to address those, to remove those. Then the director can give a notice. And if the person does not comply with that, so the notice will say, your plan is deficient in this way, and you must fix it by this time. And if that organization is not compliant, then it can move to an administrative penalty.
Okay. And then with respect to the regime under 6.9 and 611, that's more the seeking a compliance order through the Court of King's Bench. Can you speak to how that would work?
So I wonder if it might be helpful to just talk about some of the compliance measures and the enforcement tools. And I can see how it's a bit confusing because they're in different places and it's not a natural order of progression. So in terms of the compliance measures, the first step is really to do broad education with the public and obligated organizations. There's a new law, there's new requirements and what those are. And we want to do a lot of education just so that everybody has an accessibility lens. So when they're building something, developing a program, they're thinking about the needs of persons with disabilities from the beginning, because that's how those barriers are created. People just aren't thinking about what the needs are of someone who uses a mobility aid, has a hearing impairment. And so the other thing the Saskatchewan Accessibility Office will do is receive and monitor complaints about non-compliance, and the purpose of that will be to track trends. So if there's a certain organization or a sector that's people are reporting that there's a lot of specific accessibility barriers, then there can be targeted education to that group. And so in terms of the enforcement tools, we have some of those in the Act. And the purpose of those is to compel those organizations that are not complying, even after we've done a lot of education with them. And so we can do inspections to ensure an organization is following the law. And the inspector can provide an order that requires them to fix that contravention. So once we have standards, there's a requirement to do a certain thing, and we receive a complaint, then we can verify, because there's often two sides, so the inspector can verify objectively what is going on, and they can issue an order saying, you must fix this. There is a requirement, you're not following it, you need to follow it. And then if they still don't after that, it can be escalated to administrative penalties for non-compliance, and the director can issue those. And that can be a monetary fine. And then after that, we can apply to the court for a compliance order. And the last stage is then when we would apply to the Court of Queen's Bench for an offense for prosecution to be looked into and potentially a fine imposed by the court.
Okay, that's more clear, thank you. Can apply to the Court of Queen's Bench for compliance with the administrative penalty or compliance with the act? Or both, or either?
So it would be applying to the court for an order enforcing the order of the director. So the idea would be that it would give the director's order the same force as an order made by the courts.
The administrative penalties section, they're contemplated for, quote, prescribed contraventions of this act or in the regulations. Do you have some notion of where those administrative penalties are going to be applied?
Those decisions will be made as regulation development proceeds.
Yeah, and I think I was a bit confused. I think, though, there's also like a little bit of lack of clarity around the administrative penalty, a little bit of uncertainty, at least as it appears in the act, but hopefully that will be more fleshed out in regulation. The plan is to address the administrative penalty in regulation, Minister?
Yes, so the regulations will identify sort of the offenses and the levels of administrative penalties and the situations.
Okay, thank you. What does the advisory committee do besides help establish these accessibility standards? And just for those tuning in at home, the act indicates that the advisory committee will, A, advise the minister on the request of the minister with respect to any matter related to the administration of this act and the regulations, and B, to perform any other prescribed function. So the reason I asked that question, very broad, wondering what you're contemplating at this point in time beyond being involved in establishing those accessibility standards.
Thanks. Thank you. So the advisory committee certainly will play a key role in advising on developing the accessibility standards regulations. They will also play a role in facilitating engagement with the community. They will also be advising and establishing specific standards development committees, subcommittees, and also they'll be advising the minister on how to promote accessibility and removal of barriers.
How is the minister going to select individuals for that committee?
So thank you. This is actually one of the key pieces of the legislation, and really reflects the government's commitment to the nothing about us without us. The advisory committee, again, is going to be made up of a minimum of 50% persons with disabilities or organizations that support persons with disabilities, and it's going to be, again, play a key role in advising on development of the regulations. The way that the specific processes for appointing the committee members have not yet been developed. However, it will be a public application process and appointment by the minister.
That last part, a public,
Application process.
and sorry, I missed the last thing you said after that?
And then appointment by the minister.
Okay, thank you. By far, it's clear from the act that this advisory committee is going to be very significant. And by far, individual after individual, organization after organization that I spoke to, almost without exception, I'm going to say actually without exception, there was a concern not only on the part of individuals living with disabilities, but also this was articulated to me by representatives of organizations, including able-bodied folks that worked for the sector, over that word "or," that darn word "or" in there. 50% of the members of the committees are to be A, persons with disabilities, or B, persons employed by or associated with organizations that support persons with disabilities. Respectfully, Minister, it is not good enough to have 50% of the committee as able-bodied folks potentially that work in the sector. That is completely at odds with, the principle that you stated in your opening remarks, nothing with us without us, nothing for us without us. Folks are really concerned about that word "or." They don't think it should be there. They think that people living with disability are more than capable of putting forward their perspectives and their concerns on that committee. Minister, would you consider removing that word so that this committee can be at least a majority of individuals living with disabilities? We see that that self-advocates are certainly more than capable of bringing their perspectives to the table. There's no reason you can't include other people on the committee from the sector, but I think it's really important that this committee require at least 50% of folks to be living with disability. And I don't think it's good enough to include simply individuals that work in the sector.
So, thank you. So I guess one of the important things is to talk about the fact that this requires at least 50%. So that's the minimum number that needs to be on the advisory committee. So that's possible that there could be more. And one of the reasons, the main reason for including organizations that work with people with disabilities is that, as an individual is able to provide their perspective, but we feel that it's also important to hear sort of the perspective of different communities of people with disabilities. And by including the organizations in that number, that we're able to then hear from organizations that represent large numbers of people with disabilities and who work, directly with more than, and that way we get more than one person's lived experience. We actually have the benefit of, having the experience of many people who work.
Minister, it's definitely a good idea to have representation from the sector on this committee, but folks in the disability community deserve a legislated assurance that they will make up the majority of this committee. There's nothing to stop you, Minister, from appointing additional folks from the sector to get, fill gaps that you feel aren't represented by the individuals selected for the committee. I think this is really important. Again, I think it's a question of respect to have that legislated assurance, not have to rely on the goodwill of a minister to exercise good judgment and maybe get the right folks. There should be an assurance in place under this legislation that the majority of folks informing these standards are folks with lived experience. That was the whole idea behind the wheelchair challenge yesterday. Like you just don't know until, you've experienced it yourself. And that's not to say, there are all kinds of different disabilities, and it's, a person with one disability doesn't speak for others, but I think folks deserve this legislated assurance. And I just want to read to you just a couple of sentences from letters I received about section 4-3, subsection 1, or sorry, subsection 2. Section 4-2, subsection 3, which is the provision that we're discussing. Quote, this does not give people with disabilities a voice. Nothing without us. Quote, sorry, moving to a different letter. This is absolutely unacceptable. And this is from an individual that works in the sector, an able-bodied person who works in the sector. Sorry, I had a third quote in front of me, and now it's... I'll come back to this, Minister. I had a third, but I think you get the idea. And I see you nodding, and I hope that's something that you'll consider. And again, not just in terms of making an appointment on the committee, but really putting in place an assurance by way of legislation that not just yourself, but future ministers in this area will be required to have an advisory board that is made up of at least a majority of folks with lived experience. And again, it was by far one of the loudest concerns I heard. It was everyone I spoke to, and it was right off the bat, this concern with the committee. And I think it makes sense given the role that is contemplated for the committee under this act. how much has the ministry allocated in terms of dollars for overseeing the act? I believe you gave me a number for just this year at one point. I'm just wondering what the plan is in terms of the cost for administering the act going forward. I also had a question about this creation of the Saskatchewan Accessibility Office, the structure there. Will that be within the existing Office of Disability Issues? Will that be separate? Can you speak to the structure there?
So the expenditure for 23-24 is budgeted at $441,000, and I'll ask Ms. Michaud to talk about the structure.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. So the Saskatchewan Accessibility Office will be located within the Ministry of Social Services Disability Programs Division, in order to draw from the expertise of working with the community and the sector. And as is the Office of Disability Issues is also located within that division. The main differences between the two is that the Saskatchewan Accessibility Office will be focused specifically on implementing this legislation. It'll be focused on regulation development and implementation of this legislation, whereas the Office of Disability Issues has a different mandate around advising government on, policy matters and issues relating to service for people with disabilities, in many areas, including outside of this legislation, and also in helping liaise with the community. The two offices certainly will work closely and in collaboration.
Sorry if I missed this, the staff complement for the new office? And I guess, will those be new positions? Will they be moving over from the Office of Disability Issues? Can you speak to that?
The Saskatchewan Accessibility Office has 3 new positions.
And is that the total number of positions at that office?
At this time, yes.
Okay, thank you. I found the letter I wanted to refer to earlier. I am going to read the portion into the record because it actually makes a additional, I think, important point. My primary concern with this legislation is that it does not place enough priority on lived experience from people who have disabilities on the advisory board. I think they mean advisory committee. Often people who have disabilities like me can't work for nonprofits that aim to serve disabled folks because the majority of NPOs in Saskatchewan do not have health plans that would even cover my medication as a disabled person. Interesting point in terms of the barriers to being employed by some of those organizations. The timelines contemplated in the Act, Minister, can you talk about why you arrived where you did in terms of the 1-2 years, the review every 7 years, and then can you speak to the reason for the delay? I think I was asked to, specifically touch on that today. I think it was many years ago that the recommendation for this kind of legislation was made, and we certainly are an outlier as a jurisdiction. Can you just speak to why this was so long coming?
In terms of the delay that you had talked about and mentioned, this government announced in the speech from the throne in 2019, we wanted to engage on this accessibility legislation. So this is enabling legislation. This is new legislation, which in itself takes quite a bit of time, and the engagement and the consultation that we committed to do, and we did, or not we did, the ministry did, I'm sorry, engaged roughly 1,300 people. And so that does take time to writing the legislation and taking feedback from those extensive consultations just simply does take time. My understanding also the pandemic played a role in delays and timelines as well. And so, but in terms of the 7 and 10 year check-ins or what was contemplated to review some of the parts of the Act, I would ask Louise to go over that.
Thank you, Minister. So yes, the initial review period for the legislation is that there's a legislative review after 7 years and then every 10 years after that. And the reason that this does appear to be long, however, there are a number of things that matter when we do these reviews, one being certainly the ability to engage while doing the reviews. In addition, we'd be looking at, making sure that between sort of the review itself, the engagement, any potential amendments, that there's enough time to implement those amendments and then to evaluate the outcomes of that implementation before, and to give those implementations time to take effect and evaluate the outcomes before we start on the next review. You had also asked about the time frame around the 1 and the 2 years for government and public bodies respectively to develop their accessibility plans. And again, one of the key components of developing these plans will be the requirement to engage, to consult the public and to consult the community. So we wanted to ensure that there's enough time for people to, understand what the plan looks like, to develop the plan, and then to be able to engage with, affected individuals. The other thing is that we've learned, that these are workable timeframes from the experiences of other jurisdictions that have already implemented accessibility legislation. And they had some advice as well around sort of what timeline reviews might be, and making sure that there is enough time to understand the impact of, implementation of the bill itself, and then also any potential amendments that are made after a review before, starting to review it again.
Minister, it was referred to in the 2019 throne speech, but I believe the 2015 disability strategy identified the need for this legislation. So that's going back, about 8 years now. We were both copied on a letter from from the executive director of a disability organization. And it reads, "We believe the review of the Act initially in 7 years and then every 10 years afterwards is too long to establish concrete and effective change." Folks are chomping at the bit, to see these changes happen. 7 and 10 years does seem long. Can you speak directly to those folks that have specifically raised this issue in terms of the delay?
The 7 years for the initial review, and then review every 10 years. And again, the rationale for making that decision was around ensuring that, although a review happens, is that, then if amendments are made, and that there's sufficient time for those amendments to be implemented, and then for those amendments to have, or not have, the impact that they're intended to have in the community, so that there's actually sufficient time to measure the effect of initial implementation, and then potentially after a review, any amendments that might be made before reviewing again.
Thank you, Ms. Michaud. And I hear the concerns around, learning from other jurisdictions. I guess my concern is, when you look at some place like Ontario, yeah, they had some pretty ambitious timelines, but they also had some pretty ambitious requirements that aren't necessarily reflected in this act. Like, they had a set of rules that entities had to meet within 2 years, and then within 5 years, et cetera, et cetera. They had sort of prescribed requirements around implementing, for example, 10-year compliance plans with punishments laid out in great detail. I guess one of my concerns is there's less of that here. There's less kind of meat on the bone. What I'm hearing is that a lot of that is maybe going to be contemplated under regulation, but hopefully, the minister will continue to monitor the act, if not going so far as to do a formal review going forward. I have one other kind of area of questions, and then I think I just have some like final questions that won't take me very long. But can you speak, Minister, to the service and procurement accessibility standards that you think will come out of this act for healthcare, education, for housing? I don't think we see any of those standards stipulated under the act. Are those going to be in regulation? Are those going to be more contemplated under the accessibility standards? Can you speak to that? I think folks are really eager to hear a bit more on this topic.
Thank you. So again, this legislation being designed to, complement existing legislation, we looked at, as a result of receiving the feedback in the public in the engagement, we looked at education and healthcare, and what we determined was that the things that would be typically addressed under accessibility to these services would likely be more appropriately contemplated or dealt with in standards, for example, around the built environment. So if it's a physical access to healthcare spaces that isn't covered under the building code, then the built environment standards would be the place to do that. Service delivery standards, information and communication standards would also address, many of the other issues that would arise in education or healthcare.
Minister, how does it currently work? Are these, like, for example, when we're contemplating a new build, are these standards that exist in terms, and this is just as a product of my ignorance, are these standards that exist within SAS builds, or do specific ministries have accessibility standards? How does it currently work, and how does this legislation stand to kind of transform or change the status quo?
Okay, so if I understand your question, so currently there are accessibility requirements, for example, in the Building Code or Construction Codes Act. So, and the way that what this legislation is designed to do, again, the Human Rights Code, et cetera, is to fill gaps in, existing legislation where existing barriers to accessibility are not removed by that legislation. So I'll use, for example, building codes, and there are standards in building codes around things like ramp heights, doorway sizes, but there are things missing from those that create barriers. So, for example, things like coloring for people with sensory impairments or neurological differences. You would be looking potentially with the built environment at things like pathways in parks. So those are not covered under any legislation. Sort of the width or accessibility or tactile information for pathways in parks. And so the idea being that standards around the built environment would be able to address some of those gaps. An example for information and communications standards or service delivery standards might be, about rather than when somebody approaches a counter, rather than try to catch the eye, is to actually speak to an individual, or having people trained to identify if somebody's sort of not able to hear them, then how do they serve people with disabilities or different ways of communication.
It strikes me that compliance with building codes, we know that isn't resulting in sufficient accessibility, I think, for folks across the board. So I guess my first question, I guess SAS builds would be a government of Saskatchewan, contemplated under government of Saskatchewan under the Act, not a public body?
Yes.
So would Sask Builds come up with an accessibility plan just for its own workplace, or would Sask Builds be coming up with creating policies through the lens of this act, or will that be up to the other sort of areas to come up with their own standards when contemplating, for example, new initiatives and new builds and new programs, like be it communication, information and communication software, for example? Can you just maybe take me through how that's going to look?
It's actually a little bit of both. So what we would be looking at is, we're working out sort of the particulars now, the details of developing government's accessibility plan and how that's going to come together. But as you talk about sort of how government policies, et cetera, would be developed is as standards themselves are developed and put into regulations, then, any ministry that's doing their work where those standards apply would be doing that. So if we're looking at a standard, for example, for websites, then any website work done in government, if we do standards relating to information and communication, then any work done like that would have to, be done in compliance with those standards.
Minister, when do you hope the Act will come into force, and when do you hope these accessibility standards will be in place?
Before the work that is underway, that needs to happen in order for the Act to come into force is we have some general regulations that have to be developed, including the prescribing of the public bodies to whom, that the Act applies to. We also need to do the work around developing the processes for applications and establishing the advisory committee. So, that will determine the timelines for the Act coming into force. When the Act is in force, one of the key pieces, one of the key pieces of work with the advisory committee will be working on developing the standards. And, our learnings from other jurisdictions is that they typically take a phased approach to standards development. So, in consultation, we will be looking at taking a phased approach once the Act is in force to developing standards under the key areas.
Minister, why not bring some of the provisions into force so that the government of Saskatchewan can get working on those accessibility plans, for example? And I guess as a follow-up, surely you have some target in terms of how long this will take to get this legislation live. I think folks are very eager to know when that might happen.
Thank you. So, our target is actually to have things ready for winter 23-24, so this coming winter. And the reason that we want to implement the act sort of at one go is to make sure that we don't have sort of unintended consequences where start implementing some pieces of the act starts the clock on other pieces of the act. So that's why we do have, intention to keep moving on this and to have it ready by winter.
Thank you. Do you think that those regulations that will come, like the first set of regulations, will involve at least a start in terms of a list of public bodies and prescribed persons?
So the general regulations will prescribe the public bodies that will be required to have their accessibility plans ready within 2 years of the act coming into force.
Perfect, but no plans for any otherwise prescribed persons at this point?
Typically, those would be found in specific standards.
Okay. Will municipalities be included in public bodies?
That's going to be fleshed out in the regulations.
I did do some consultations at that level, and what I heard was that cities need to do more to ensure physical mobility barriers are removed from civic life. And particularly from councillors, I heard that funding streams for new built environment standards should be established by the province, because of course this stuff ain't cheap. And then I heard also that often larger Saskatchewan cities have the resources sometimes required to develop, finance, and deploy accessibility initiatives, but a lot of smaller communities really struggle with the capacity to do that. So I guess what I'm wondering is whether in terms of public bodies like municipalities or future prescribed persons, whether there will be any delineated funding streams available to entities contemplated under the Act in meeting these standards.
Not contemplated under this legislation, so that's decisions to be made later.
Okay, thank you. I also heard at the city level that provincial standards around procurement policies would provide much needed direction. Do you think that this legislation will provide for those kinds of standards for city level, for municipalities rather?
Possibly, as procurement is one of the areas contemplated for, that's identified for regulation development. So, but details of that would be, again, developed in regulation making.
Was there any thought given to making an Office of Disability much like the other independent offices of the Legislative Assembly? This is certainly a concept that I support. Minister, have you given any thought to that? I believe there's some precedent for that elsewhere.
So thank you. So the decision was made to locate it in the Ministry of Social Services Office, division, Disability Programs Division, and that decision was made in order to take advantage of existing expertise and around serving people with disabilities, and also because having it sort of within executive government makes it easier as sort of a government-led implementation act for cross-ministry collaboration, and just so those were the reasons chosen to locate it within the ministry.
Thank you, Ms. Michaud. And one of the topics that came up quite a bit around the Accessibility Act during my consultations were questions around housing, Saskatchewan Housing Corporation, and the lack of housing stock that really meets the needs of folks with barriers. Minister, can you speak a bit to how you think this act is going to improve that within the Sask Housing Corporation, what the plans are around accessibility housing, and assurances that this issue of a lack of accessibility housing stock might somehow be addressed in some way under this act?
Thank you. So the purpose of this act is actually to identify and identify and remove accessibility barriers to existing services. And as standards are developed, Saskatchewan Housing Corporation will be an active, sort of be a participator and collaborator in how standards are developed, and will certainly comply with accessibility standards.
Minister, do you think that this act will lead to Saskatchewan Housing Corporation renovating, upgrading, and/or building accessible accommodation in Saskatchewan?
This act wouldn't sort of prescribe, numbers or changes, but some of the standards that have yet to be developed would, may have impacts on, or may have sort of changes, result in changes to services of the Sask Housing Corporation, but those are not known yet.
Thank you. The advisory committee, the act contemplates that the standards will be available for general public input, but there's no obligation on the part of the minister to publish the outcome of such consultations. Will the minister commit to making those consultations public and making the outcome of the advisory committee's consultation and advice public? I guess my concern here is that, as it is, the legislation contemplates the minister being able to request advice from the committee, but there's no requirement that the public be aware of the contents of that advice in any way, shape, or form. And so there's obviously the risk that the minister could, and this isn't personal, Minister Mikowski, but yourself or any future minister could simply hide behind the committee and say, we did consultation and this is where we ended, without really, showing their homework or in any kind of way, or putting on the public record what the results of the committee's work was.
So we do contemplate a lot of opportunity for, for engagement. The advisory committee, when developing the standards, will be engaging with the public. The draft standards themselves would be, also put out for public engagement, and then we would be looking at, potentially like what we heard reports, et cetera.
So it sounds like there's a fair bit of transparency kind of built into the process.
Yes.
Thank you. What I hear consistently is, given the interaction with folks with disability, have, frequent interactions with healthcare, education, housing concerns, as we all do. But I think there's a lot of concern over the lack of service and procurement accessibility standards in those three main areas. Is there anything more, Minister, you can say tonight in terms of putting some meat on the bone around those standards? Or is it a wait and see?
Thank you. So, we don't want to presuppose what will be in the regulations. That would be developed, again, informed by the voices of the advisory committee and individuals, and consultation with the public. So committed to that. Nothing about us without us. We would defer those answers till the regulations.
Thank you. Minister, I, in my disability portfolio, the three kind of most often, the three issues that come up the most often in my office are the inadequacy of the SED rates, the crisis within the CBO sector, the recruitment and retention wage benefit crisis, and the cancellation of the STC and the impact that had in particular on the disability community, particularly in rural settings. I know one of the letters that I read from today was from an individual who had to move into the city after the cancellation of the STC because he could no longer go back and forth for the care that he needed. Do you think there's anything under this act that will change or improve those three issues? Publicly available transportation across the province, accessible transportation, because we know how that ended with the Riders Express, for example, crisis within the CBO sector, and the inadequacy of SED rates. Can you speak to that?
So in terms of the question, what I would say again, this, and it's been explained a few times by officials, but this legislation is about removing barriers, existing barriers, accessibility of existing services, not about service levels, not who's eligible, and adequacy of rates, et cetera. So again, focusing on removing of existing barriers.
Thank you, Minister. I would suggest that for sure the lack of accessible transportation is a huge barrier for folks. But with that all being said, I know it's been a long day and a long night for everyone, and I have no further questions, so thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Conway. Are there any more questions or comments from any committee members? Not seeing any, we will proceed to vote on the clauses. Clause 1-1, short title, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 1-2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 1-3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 1-4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 1-5, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 1-6, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 1-7, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 2-1, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 2-2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 2-3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 3-1, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 3-2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 3-3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 4-1, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 4-2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 4-3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 4-4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 4-5, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5-1, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5-2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5-3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5-4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5-5, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5-6, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5-7, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5-8, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5-9, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5-10, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6-1, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6-2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6-3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6-4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6-5, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6-6, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6-7, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6-8, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6-9, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6-10, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6-11, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 7-1, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 7-2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 7-3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 7-4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 7-5, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 8-1, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 8-2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 8-3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 8-4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 9-1 coming into force, is that agreed? Carried. His Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, enacts as follows the Accessible Saskatchewan Act. I would ask a member to move that we report Bill number 103, the Accessible Saskatchewan Act, without amendment. Mr. Friesen moves. Is that agreed? Carried. Minister Makowski, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
Well, thank you very much for the questions and officials for being here and all the hard work officials have done to get us to this point in this act, and more work coming, but we have a start here, so thanks to the committee again.
Terrific. Thank you, Minister. And Ms. Conway, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
I do. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to summarize a little bit of, I think, hopefully what I tried to bring to this committee. It was the result of significant consultation. I do, think it's a positive step forward to have the Accessibility Act. My questions hopefully reflected some of my concerns, though, around the lack of detail around the scope and application of the Act, standards, clear requirements around timelines and implementation, the lack of, application potentially to the private sector, noting, of course, that should be a phased-in approach, and that the government has a role to play in making the case for greater accessibility, perhaps even financial grants to ease the burden of that. But what I heard tonight is that a lot of these details will be fleshed out in regulation, so I'll be waiting, to have a look at that, of which the advisory committee will have an important role. So I'm hoping to see that advisory committee is a robust process, a transparent process, and as I raised earlier tonight, is a process of which the majority of the voices on that committee represent the voices of folks with lived experience. So with that, I would like to thank the officials for being here tonight, thank the minister, thank the members of the committee, the staff, Hansard, everyone. I know it was a long night, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Conway. And on behalf of the committee, I'd like to also thank Hansard, Legislative Services, as well as Building Security for ensuring that everything in this facility runs smoothly and into the evening. So that concludes our business for today. I would ask a member to move a motion of adjournment. Mr. Hargrave has moved. All agreed? Carried. This committee stands adjourned until Tuesday, May 9th, 2023 at 3:30 p.m.